Well, thank you for joining after lunch. So I think I'm going to discuss about assessment. So from yesterday, we have been talking about risk-based approach, risk assessment, that compliance is easy, but we need to take risk-based approach. So let's start our conversation about assessment first. So the concept of the risk assessment dates back to the ancient Greeks, 2,400 years ago. So while the principle and concept has not changed much, the method of the assessing risk has changed considerably. Why? Because we're trying to adapt the methodology to the problems that we're trying to solve. So right now you can see in OT cybersecurity, we have different methodologies already. So you can see cyber-informed engineering, ISO 62443-3-2. We have also audit, which checks against benchmarks, pass-fail outcome. Then we have cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, cyber-physical risk assessment, and on top of it, right now, which is popular, is OT penetration testing. So I'm going to discuss about OT penetration testing, cyber-physical risk assessment, and cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, because we have talked about cyber-informed engineering a lot. Mark touched as well today. And ISO 62443-3-2, it's a standard base, so all of you can have access to the ISO standards and review and get the training from ISO as well. So my focus will be the assessments that I'm doing on a daily basis in different projects. So before moving to the assessment, let's distinguish between risk assessment and the vulnerability assessment. Here we need to make sure that OT penetration test is a part of the vulnerability assessment. It's just more intrusive. So when we distinguish between risk assessment and vulnerability assessment, we need to focus on the threats. So in order threats to be successful, threats should have an opportunity to attack, threat must have an intent to execute an attack, and threat should have a capability to attack. If some of these conditions are missing, attack will not be successful. So the first one on the right side, you can see the actual threats. So actual threats means attacks has been executed, vulnerability has been observed, so 3 out of the 3 conditions are there. So then we have viable threats. So viable threat means that we have seen cyber attacks, but the exposure of the vulnerability is not there. Since exposure can change any time, we can say it's a 3 out of the 3 conditions are meeting. When I say 3 out of the 3, it's opportunity, capabilities, intents are there. Then we have potential threat. Potential threats meaning there is a proof of concept, but cyber attacks has not been observed. Then we have elusive threats. When we say elusive threats, it's least likely to happen. So 2 out of 3 conditions are missing. So here comes the main difference. So vulnerability assessment is looking to the existing assets and security gaps, which can be exploited by threat actors and cause a damage. So when plant conducts a vulnerability assessment, it's looking to the actual threats. So to the actual vulnerabilities and trying to mitigate it. Risk assessment, it's looking outside of the organization. It's looking to the future. So if I give an example with a history, so risk assessment evaluates which armies should approach the castle and which weapons to wear, while vulnerability assessment is checking the locks and the doors. So for each plant, risk assessment is good to evaluate the potential threats and get the cybersecurity requirements before the design phase, while vulnerability assessment is looking whether the security measures are in place or not. So if we speak in legal terms, you can do without vulnerability assessment. However, the risk assessment is mandatory to every installation which poses HSE risk. So if there is a safety risk involved. So let's start with the cyber-physical risk assessment. With cyber-physical risk assessment, the first comes the question, what is the excellent cybersecurity? I think we have been asking these questions from yesterday. What is the criteria for excellence? So criteria for the excellence is every plan needs to meet loss criteria. So this loss criteria is defined by the regulation, by the industrial organization, who are responsible for safe operation of the plant. So risk criteria for loss, there is a severity involved. So when we say severity, severity determines risk criteria for loss tolerance criteria. So I know it's complicated. So when we say risk tolerance criteria, so every plant should meet risk tolerance criteria independent of the cost. When we say independent of cost, regulation, they need to make sure every plant is meeting risk tolerance criteria independent of cost. It's a cyber attack or it's a process safety accident. So here, I'm trying to link what is the relationship between cybersecurity and process safety. So if a cybersecurity accident is causing the loss event consequences, then it needs to meet risk tolerance criteria which has been set and accepted by process safety. Then, and where we are taking these consequences, we're taking the consequences from LOPA or HAZOP scenarios. So we take the HAZOP scenarios and looking for the hackable devices. If these loss scenarios can be done by cyber attack. So I will give you an example. I know it's a little bit of complicated, and this is a site where I've worked for, by the way. So let's take a reactor. So main hazard here is a thermal runaway reaction. So what can be cause for this hazard? So the main hazard can be loss of cooling water. So, and the main consequence is an explosion. So for the loss of cooling water, we might have two causes. The first, from process safety perspective, it can be random failure of the equipment. How? It can be wear and tear down, right? Then we might have another cause, which can be cybersecurity, malicious shutdown. So the two cause, which is first one is a process safety accident, another one cybersecurity incident. If there is no preventative controls, it leads to the explosion. When it leads to the explosion, it leads to the risk tolerance. So here we are talking about fatality. Now, here comes the cyber-physical risk assessment. So I would like to give credit to my colleague. Cyber-physical risk assessment methodology has been developed by Sinclair Coilamish. He spent more than 10 years to develop this methodology, and I was a lucky one to get this knowledge from him, and right now I'm doing in real life and assessing big greenfield and brownfield projects, sites, I mean. So what is a cyber-physical risk assessment? This is a official terminology, but I will explain further on in more high level. So cyber-physical risk assessment, it's extending the cybersecurity risk. When we say cybersecurity risk, what is this? It can be loss of view, loss of control, loss of engineering data. These are the technical cybersecurity risks. So these cybersecurity risks are linking to the production process installation. Therefore, we're trying to link those risk with the loss criteria, which means we're linking to the fatality, to the individual risk, to the societal risk, to the environmental damage as well. So who are giving us this risk tolerance criteria? Government and countries are specifying, and regulators are specifying this risk tolerance criteria, which is in our next slide. So in this slide, let me first tell you in the risk matrix. This risk matrix is every asset owner has risk matrix, which is 5 to 5, 4 to 5, and then in risk matrix we have decision, right? Tolerable, acceptable, tolerable, non-acceptable, and non-acceptable. But how are plants, they make a decision? They make a decision according to their risk tolerance criteria. So the limit of the risk tolerance criteria, we call it target mitigated event likelihood. And who are from process safety, they know this terminology already. So target mitigated event likelihood is set by the country. And the country follows the principle, ALARP or ALARA. Singapore follows the ALARP principle. So ALARP principle, it basically says there is no absolute security. There is inherent risks in any activities that we carry out. So which means we are trying to reduce our risk as practically as reasonable. So here in TML, you can see in the first column, it's individual risks, then we have societal risks, then we have environmental risk, and we have financial risk as well. Financial risk is usually set by the asset owners. So here the example can be in terms of individual risk. So in 100,000 years, you cannot exceed the fatality rate. So our aim is to mitigate our risk from cybersecurity perspective to meet this risk tolerance criteria. And I forgot to mention, cyber physical risk assessment is a semi-quantitative. When we say semi-quantitative, in risk assessment, we have qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative, as you may know, right now we're mostly using in cybersecurity risk assessment qualitative. It's mostly done by subject matter experts. Quantitative is based on statistical data and it's pure numbers. But in cybersecurity, it's very, very hard to achieve pure quantitative data. That's why we call the cyber physical risk assessment semi-quantitative risk assessment. Where we are deriving our quantitative data, you can see from a screen, it is a TML. So next, I will show you the formula, how we relate OT, cyber physical risk assessment with the process safety. So this is your main goal. You are trying to make sure that you are not exceeding target mitigated event likelihood. And target mitigated event likelihood is set by the regulatory bodies, by country, which is fatality, environmental damage, and financial loss as well. So the first formula is a process safety. I think Marco knows it very well, right? So in process safety, we have initiating event frequency, which is a failure. Then we have the second formula, safe instrumented function. It depends from the SEAL level, SEAL 1, SEAL 2. And then we have some physical security barrier. Then from process, this is LOPA, right? Then from process safety, we're trying to link to the cyber physical risk assessment formula. So here we are having TTP, so initiating event frequencies. Then when we say exposure, we're looking to the asset. Asset, we say engineering workstation, and we have channels. Channels can be your Modbus protocol or HART protocol. So when we say exposure, we're looking, do they have authentication, in which level they are located, level 1, level 2, so on and so forth. Then you have risk reduction factors, which means, do you have countermeasures in place? Then we have our physical mechanical barrier, right? We take into this account as well. So this is OT cybersecurity relates with the process safety. However, we have dependencies, which means that main difference between process safety and OT cybersecurity, we are very much connected. That's why we need to analyze for dependencies, and we call it rings of protection analysis, but it is, I'm not going to discuss this, it's way too technical, but the very simplified formula is this. It's a cyber physical risk. It's first you have probability of attack. So probability of attack is qualitative, meaning there is no statistical available. Then you have probability of success and attack. So which means it's a vulnerability, but it's more quantified. And then you have impact, which is technical, process, business impact. I'm going to discuss impact in the next slide, but this formula is not calculated manually. This formula is calculated on the tool, because in order to come up with a probability, you need to have different threat scenarios, which I'm going to discuss in the next slides. So what is the impact? When we say about impact, this is kind of a Purdue model, yes? So the first, you have cyber attack scenarios, you have technical loss scenarios. When we say technical loss, as I said before, let's say attacker is attacking the HMI, operator station. What is the technical loss you have? Your alarm can be disabled. You can have a loss of view. The integrity might be lost. But what does it mean to your plant? Then you're trying to connect with production losses. How you're trying to connect with the production losses? You're working with your process safety engineers. They bring you the HAZOP and LOPA analysis. You're taking those analyses and you're linking together. Then you have, if you remember from Colonial Pipeline attack, yeah, it was in enterprise level and it was a business loss. So you still need to connect with your business losses. Whereas production losses are related with environmental risks and fatality risk, business loss is always, most of the time, is a financial. So where are you getting business loss? Usually if you have business impact analysis. So the next slide shows the example of a tax scenario. When I said you need to calculate all the probabilities, you need to build, before calculating this, cyber attack scenarios. So when you build the cyber attack scenarios, it looks complicated, but you divide to the units first. Let's say you have BPCS, you have SIS, you have alarm management system, you have power management system. You take this and then you look for the assets. What kind of assets are present there and what kind of channels? When I say assets, HMI, engineering workstation, you have a historian, then you have also the protocols, as I said, HART, it can be vendor proprietary protocol as well. You take this and you start building attack scenarios. So in the first, it is time consuming, it takes a lot of time, but once you build this artifact, this repository, you can reuse it and just apply some minor changes. So here, the first you have threat actors. When we say threat actors, you have insider threats, we have discussed today. And in insider threats, you have malicious insider, non-malicious insiders, and you have hacktivists. Then you have also advanced persistence threats. So in total, in my case, in our case, we identified 8 threat actors. So these threat actors, they perform some actions, right? They have some scenarios. Then they have likelihood, right? So the likelihood, we call it initiating event frequency. Where are we getting, when we build this scenario, this likelihood, these scenarios? Usually we're getting from MITRE, ICS, TTP. This is quite statistical data. Then we have the scenarios, we move on. So what threat actor is going to do? It's going to exploit the vulnerability. So you have vulnerability, and if you have cybersecurity countermeasures in place, it's a green. So you are protected from that vulnerability. Then in the middle, you have, we call it hazard, because we try to simplify, use the one word with the process safety. You have the hazard, meaning, for example, manipulation of engineering workstation. Then you have a consequence, which means, I explained to you, it's a technical loss. When you have consequence, you might have some safeguards. When I say safeguards, which is unhackable, it can be key switch in your safety station. Now, we need to connect this cybersecurity risk with our loss scenarios, which comes the next one. So here we are trying to connect with the loss scenario. So in the beginning, we have threat actors. They perform some actions. They cause these consequences. Let's say they attacked, as I said, engineering workstation, and then they modified PLC. If they have modified PLC, what happens with the plant? What is the loss? Here it's connecting with the hazard analysis. Here, in this situation, it can be thermal runaway reaction. What is the impact? Impact is the explosion. And what is the risk? Risk is the individual death, right? Or it can be more. So this is about cyber physical assessment in a very high level. But when it comes to the risk assessment, a lot of asset owners, they get confused. When should I do risk assessment? And we have been, from the first panel we were discussing, and in the panel, it should start from the feed stage, which means you have started your project, you still have not identified your vendors. So you can do high-level risk assessment and then identify your vendors. But of course, you don't have assets, you don't have vulnerabilities, you take the hypothetical vulnerabilities, right? So, but you do this risk assessment in order to, as Marco says, risk assessment should be baked in, not bolted on. So then you move on during the design phase. Design phase, when you have all the sheets available, like HAZOP and LOPA has been executed, you are taking your high-level assessment and you start performing your detailed risk assessment and link with your risk tolerance criteria. Here, in your design stage, how you're preparing your risk assessment. You're looking functional design specification and saying, oh, okay, they're going to use this protocol and they're going to enable TLS, right? Security features. But then we need to verify that it has been enabled or not. So in verification validation phase, we're trying to verify, is it still meeting our target TML, target mitigated event likelihood? And of course, during operation phase, we have changing threat landscape, and we need to verify security still covering those threats or not. So this is the stages that you can use your risk assessment, starting from the design, starting from the feed stage. Next, we move on to the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. So I think I forgot to mention. So why I picked up cybersecurity vulnerability assessment and OT pen test cyber physical risk assessment, I'm trying to make sure to bring you the difference and what kind of value they bring and when can you perform this. So cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, when we say vulnerability assessment, mostly asset owners think it's a technical task. So you do some technical activities. But usually cybersecurity vulnerability assessment is performed according to some benchmark. It can be ISO 62443, NIST document, and most important, you need to perform vulnerability assessment according to your vendor's guidelines, because usually vendor provides security guideline which has not been implemented by the asset owners. So you can identify that as well. So usually the scope of the CSVA, it includes policies and procedure. It's not the technical as well, physical security, security architecture, network architecture, and cybersecurity management. So how you perform cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, it cannot be done remotely. You should go to site and perform on-site cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. I don't believe when it's done remotely. Maybe risk assessment can be done, but vulnerability assessment. So when you're done on-site, the tools that you're using, before using this tool, you have to make sure that it has been tested and it has been approved. If you have 3 vendor DCS, it has been approved by those vendors. Otherwise, you might cause unexpected outages and cause more damage than you are trying to solve. When we do vulnerability assessment, usually we do for maturity planning and for roadmaps. Here is just an example of the cybersecurity maturity. So when can we apply the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment? Usually after FAT. After FAT, meaning you have already all the cabinets, switches, all your servers, and then you can do scanning there more safely. Then you can do after SAT, but in my experience, we have done this before ready for operation, meaning before integration with the brownfield or before bringing up to the production. During the operation phase, you can do once a year if you have mature environment. And if you have performed migration, better to do after the migration, after the major project change. And you need to rely also automated continuous monitoring. Here I would like to note automated continuous monitoring. In OT environment, you cannot scan. You cannot put the agent on your endpoint and perform all the scanning activities there. So here you have to be very smart to choose the ICS product which has been tested and verified to use there. If you're, for example, I can tell you from architecture perspective, you can get the product that collects the data, but the scanning, everything is done in other servers, which is independent from the, let's say, DCS architecture. I think I have 6 minutes left. So this is just an example. Let's say this is your architecture. You are doing cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. What you are doing, you are collecting all the information on the site. Then first, you are looking, this is your as-is architecture. Then you are looking to your architecture. Why safety system is a network with a BPCS. So you're looking to these weaknesses. Then next, you are looking to your domain controller first, because the domain controller right now is the main target for attackers. For example, here, if you have replication of your domain controller to the DMZ, it's bad. Then you're looking identity and access controls. So when I say identity and access controls, what are you looking for? The first users, right? Why engineers have access to the, let's say, servers, or why IT personnel has access to the DCS server. Another thing, you're looking for the service accounts. Usually the service accounts doesn't have password expiration. They have all the privileged access. You need to ask, is it according to the vendor guideline, or they just put it this way to make it easier? Then you come up, of course, you look for the updates. If you have AV, if you have a Microsoft update, whether the signature up to date or not. And when I say updates, it should be vendor approved updates. So next one is OT pen testing. What is about OT penetration test? I'm just covering in 2 slides. Justin will cover more after this session in engineering track if you'd like to know more. So I'm just covering in high level what is really OT pen test. When we say about OT pen test, we have 3 types. Yeah, the first thing is the white box. White box, you have everything, and you have all the admin privileges. Then you have gray box. Gray box, you have minor information and minor access. Example can be from business to OT network. You might have just regular user access, and you know your boundaries, and you need to perform your pen test. Black box, meaning you don't have any access. From business network to OT network, you don't have any credentials. You have to perform penetration testing. When you start drafting this pen testing proposals, or not proposal, requirements, you need to take into mind, if you would like to do black box, it consumes more time, it is more risky. If you would like to do gray box, it is less risky, it's a less time consuming. And then white box, of course, it is more safe. But preferred method will be more gray box, but I would not advise you, and then from my experience, how we have done, we define from levels. For example, from level 4 to level 3.5 to DMZ, you can perform black box. From level 3.5, you can go to level 3, let's say gray box, and then you can go by white box if it's very critical in your level 2 devices. That's why you can minimize your risk, but at the same time get more value. So this is a breakout of breaking the pen testers into the phases. So from L4 to L5 to L4, you are trying to establish a foothold in IT environment. How? By spear phishing, by social engineering. Then you have perimeter phase from L4 to L3.5. So you're looking any credentials to get into the foothold in the ICS. So basically you're moving from stage 1 attack to the stage 2 attack. From L3.5 to L3, it's usually, you know your boundaries, you know your subnet, you know your assets which you're trying to attack. And then sometimes if you're doing this on site, you have site personnel who is with you. And then if you have found vulnerability in the L3, L2, usually it has been reported to the asset owner, but it has not been exploited due to the risks. So this is just an example. I have 2 minutes left. When can we do pen test? Usually pen test, people think we can do only in the brownfield. It all starts from the design phase. When we start the design phase, we start loading up all the configurations. So how we can check, for example, we have set the set points in HMI, and we try to put the set points, whether it's accepted or not accepted. Then after FAT and SAT, then post-SAT commissioning. So before ready for operation, why pen testing has been done? Usually, I've been in a greenfield project, usually I know all the credentials. So when I hand over to the asset owners, the first thing they have to do is remove all my credentials. They have to change all the credentials. They need to apply all the hardening. So this is where trying to check whether it has been done or not, and other vulnerabilities as well. And during the operation, the same thing as in vulnerability assessment, but here, again, you can rely on automatic scanning with dedicated ICS product. It is possible right now, for example, to check whether the configuration changes has been done. For example, if you hardened your system, you closed your ports, you disabled your services, has it been changed? You can also track it, but again, it has to be approved, not vendor product, but ICS product. So the conclusion and key takeaway. So cyber physical risk assessment, we call it cybersecurity hazard. It defines the security design requirements. So we're looking to the potential, or to all the threats, usually to the potential threat. Our main goal is here to mitigate our risks to meet risk tolerance criteria, which is TML. And when we do this, we're not taking into account only cybersecurity controls, we are taking also the physical safeguards as well. The next one is the cybersecurity vulnerability assessment. We're looking for the potential threats. We're checking if these requirements are properly implemented or not. We're directly looking to the system's implementation. And OT penetration testing is proof of the pudding is in the eating, which means we are trying to attempt to find one or more threats not properly defended against. Usually OT pen tests, if you're in brownfield, if you have installed all of your security countermeasures, you're conducting, are my security controls are functioning? Or if I have blue team, are they really monitoring the threats? So I think I have not exceeded my time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Mashirova. Let us now invite our moderator for the session, Dr. Magda Celli, Managing Director, Chief Information Security Officer at Responsible Cyber. Dr. Celli is recognized globally for her in-depth cybersecurity knowledge, and her professional journey in cybersecurity has been multifaceted, serving varied industries and organizations. She honed her skills as an information security officer for multinational insurance firms, concurrently initiating businesses centered on providing global cyber advisory services. Dr. Celli's entrepreneurial streak further led her to co-found a startup in Singapore, Responsible Cyber, dedicated to helping organizations make responsible cyber a top priority. Dr. Celli, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. AI moderator. Good afternoon, first of all, everyone. I would like to welcome as well on the stage Mrs. Sarah Flux, please, to join us in this panel discussion. So we had this really insightful presentation by Saltanat about risk assessment in the OT environment. And I believe that it's a topic not only that needs to be assessed and discussed further, but as well maybe raise a little bit more awareness about the challenges and the misconceptions that we have, especially knowing how currently the environment are converging between OT, operational technology, and IT, information technology. And the misconception as first that OT is still air-gapped. And as such, I would like to start by mentioning that this belief specifically is something that puts us way behind the reality that we are currently living in and the eventual threats and risk that our organization might be exposed to. And as such, I would definitely give you an example. If you, for example, use Shodan, which is an online open source database, if we consider that all OT environments are air-gapped and not connected to the internet, you would be surprised by doing a simple research how many OT and IoT devices are found on Shodan, available to anyone and everyone who just goes online and search, knowing specific ports that are used by those devices. Very interesting exercise to do. But let's go directly to the questions and maybe address as well those misconceptions about penetration testing. And we talked about this with Ms. Saltanat explaining penetration testing and giving as well a very interesting, in my view, methodology. And I would like to start by that specific point. I heard some cybersecurity professionals working in OT environments saying that no way they will perform penetration testing, that this is not something that we are able to do due to the fact, and of course, the challenges of eventually interrupting the operations of a plant, and the first or major objective is to keep the availability. So perhaps let's take a step back towards the penetration testing concept and explain a little bit further. Is it something that is commonly done? How someone would actually start the strategy to ensure that it's accepted by the business and that actually they are able to run it? Many questions in one, but I would like Saltanat to take a step back again from your presentation.
Sure. I think about OT pen test, we'll know more in Justin's presentation, but yeah. So here's the two again, greenfield and brownfield, I always mention. So the most, asset owners' concerns of when you have plants up and running, which is a brownfield project, most asset owners are concerned performing OT penetration testing that it can cause damage. The first thing here to take into account that some asset owners I have seen, and we have done it, they do OT pen testing until DMZ level, which means if the DMZ level compromised, they think it means they are not secure, so it's enough. But the second thing about it, it relates to asset owner and to I think the company who provides OT penetration testing is that it is related to the skills. So asset owners cannot invite pen tester who has never been on plant or coming from the IT pen testing background to perform the penetration testing. This is the one thing that asset owners should keep in mind. The second thing is asset owners, I have seen in one plant, they don't know their critical assets first. The second thing, they don't know in terms of how they have patched or not patched. For example, one time the pen testing has been performed, so they have 4 identical HMI operator stations. So they have patched them all. They thought they have patched them all, but the 4th station was not patched. So when the pen testing was performed to that specific station, they got loss of view. So which means asset owners first, they have to know which assets are critical, and then in terms of have they patched or not. And the third thing is when penetration testers start performing pen testing activities, asset owners needs to ask to notify them every vulnerability that they have found. Usually, if you reach level 3 and level 2, you don't exploit the vulnerability. Or the safe time to perform penetration testing is during the turnaround time.
Thank you very much. I think the point about making it very clear that OT penetration testing and IT penetration testing are different is very, very important. But as part of that, I have been reading and really interested about a concept that is called digital twins. And Sarah, I would like to a little bit hear from you about using this concept to perform assessments such as penetration testing to reduce eventual, again, risk of disruption or the challenges that come with it. Can you please elaborate about this a little bit further?
Sure, okay. I think when talking about digital twins, it's crucial that because it's such a fancy name, that we think about what a digital twin actually is. And a digital twin is no more nor less than a model of the plant that we have, may contain some data structures and algorithms in there. And the important thing about a model is that it's always only representing a fraction of reality. So the digital twin, first to make that clear, then to the question, can never really represent accurately the entire plant. Now, digital twins can be used for a lot of purposes, and I think one of the purposes that is very useful is what you just mentioned, that you can, for purposes which actually very critical or has a high risk of disruption to your plant, you can test and try some things at the digital twin at the plant potentially. So you could think about doing tests or doing patch rollout tests or penetration tests at a digital twin. And here comes the but. I haven't seen so many really successful digital twins in implementation yet. Maybe that's different for you. But one of the big problems is that we have, for many concepts, it's more important than getting them implemented quickly, that's standardization. For digital twins, I think the opposite is true, because a true digital twin really becomes helpful once you can exchange the information between different vendors. A digital twin in an industrial plant, you have so many different vendors of control systems, of PLCs and everything in there. In order to represent all that, ideally, the vendors would give some information to provide for the digital twin. But in order to have interoperable digital twins, they would have to agree on a standard how to provide that. That's one of the biggest challenge in my point of view regarding digital twins. And standardization data models for digital twins, which in the end pretty boring, but that's what needs to be done. Is you need a standardized information model for a digital twin where people feed their information into. So potentially yes. In reality, I think we are a couple years away from that.
Yeah, so practical implementation is far behind yet. Yeah, for sure. Like this is a challenge that comes down as well from having visibility in general, I guess. And this links to what Saltanat, you mentioned patch management and the lack of visibility. What is the real status across the whole environment? So I want to come back onto that topic specifically, patch management. So I believe as well, one of the other misconceptions around OT environment is the fact that we are air gapped, or we still have that specific perimeter where there's no connection with the external world. But how do you see the current patch management when it comes to specific vendor, and links as well to what Sarah you mentioned, linked to specifically vendor-related equipment, where the maintenance is only done when someone comes physically into the plant? Saltanat, over to you.
Okay, patch management, so it depends from the asset owner's maturity level, I would say. Yeah, we have discussed yesterday that you need to patch only 2% of your vulnerability, which is applicable to you. The first thing, you need to look to your maturity level. For example, I have seen the customers, asset owners, who have state-of-the-art technology, like they have virtualization, they have redundancy, and they do patch management no matter what, every month. They have very mature technology in place to do this because of the redundancy. And I have seen the asset owners who have still Windows XP, and they do the patch management once in 3 years. So the first thing, it depends from your maturity level. The second thing is you have to think from risk-based approach again. Is this vulnerability really applicable to my environment? Or can I apply compensating controls until my next turnaround time? When can I apply patches? Because usually, I mean, most of the field instrumented PLCs are not secure. And then they really rely currently on the authentication, on the access control, and the network segmentation on the next tools. So when we do this risk assessment, that's why we are trying to apply defense in-depth strategy to that. So if you haven't applied patch today, it cannot expose your critical assets if you have applied proper defense in depth.
Thank you. Sarah, I believe you want to add to this.
I think if you really go all the way and implement a methodology that Sarana just introduced, and you have these semi-quantitative assessments, you actually have a really good database for deciding if a patch is applicable or not. The challenge is, and that's also the challenge that I think discussed with Sinclair about 100 times, is how do you really get all that data? That's maybe something that I would really be interested if I were to ask a question here, maybe I am, to really be interested in you explaining, like, how do you actually get to maintain all this data, and how do you actually do that? So because there's in the formula that you showed, there is things like TTP frequency. I think the whole industry would be so grateful if we had data like that. And I know that Honeywell does it in a way, so I think that's something worthwhile explaining to the audience.
Yeah, data is big. So myself, I'm executing this assessment not to the one plant, to the one asset owner, right? It's a different asset owners. That's why I have database, so we keep adding it. We have all this database repository. If asset owners starts from the scratch, it takes time. Yeah, it takes several months to get all the data. For example, I just want to give an example what I have done last month. I have done this threat scenarios and consequences for power management system, and it took a month to do this. So yeah, it's a big data, but since we are providing the services, we're having this repository. And yesterday, Rob mentioned a lot of plants are standardized now, so hard is everywhere hard. It depends only from architecture-wise and from impact and from consequence-wise usually.
Thank you, ladies. I think here we as well touch another problem that exists in those environments is the legacy systems, where we have Windows XP, and the reality is that practitioners that want to secure the organizations still need to find ways to do it, either by asking the management for licenses to upgrade, which is coming with their own challenges, or basically to build in place compensating controls, which in itself might be challenging as well as a task. But let's come back to that topic. I think what's really important is, first of all, to understand that risk assessment goes beyond just penetration testing. And Saltanat, you mentioned something that I am passionate about is building loss scenarios and quantification as well. In general, this concept has been applied in insurance for a very long time. But unfortunately, in cybersecurity, it hasn't. So we still do a lot of qualitative assessment. And of course, reality is that if we take a list of risk scenarios that sometimes show only threat and go to the management asking for budget with colors, they will not very immediately accept the budget request, or they might have challenges to understand why something is red and critical. It is because it's subjective, while quantification gives some more tangible outcomes with numbers that might specifically bring that additional insights. So, Saltanat, when someone is new to this concept, building loss scenarios, specifically in the OT environment, what exactly should they do first?
The first thing, if you are, it again depends from the life cycle of the industrial automation control system. It starts, as I said, if you start from the beginning, feed stage, we call it, you don't have assets yet, then you make it more high level, you make it more in hypothetical way. But if you have already assets in place, the first thing you divide these assets into functions. When I say functions, because you might have one engineering workstation or one operator station. Today, Marco mentioned from operator station, you can change safety systems and you can change BPCS systems, right? This is two different functions, which leads to the two different consequences. So the first thing you need to divide to the functions, then you need to identify your channels. When I say the channels, the protocols, because most ICS protocols are not secure.
But does this mean as well that we need to understand the business, right? If we're talking about functions.
Yes, yes. So understanding your architecture-wise, it is a #1 requirement. Yeah, without this knowledge, I mean, the risk. So let's say risk assessment should be done by risk analyst. So risk analyst is not the person who are deploying just antivirus software or just maintaining CM solutions. Risk analysts who understand the process, who understands the process safety, and who understands the cybersecurity as well. So this is a risk analyst.
Thank you very much, Sata. Sarah, I think you have as well something to add on this topic.
I think what Saltanat says, that starting out with functions is actually key to two things. So first, getting the engineer's knowledge into the risk assessment, because if you don't do that, you can just forget the entire risk assessment. You need to have the engineer's knowledge in there. And also is something that's really close to how engineers usually think. If they are, for example, safety engineers, and I think a lot of the methodology builds upon safety knowledge, so it makes sense to have safety engineers in there anyway. The concept of thinking in functionalities and functions is very close to them. So it's not something that they have to go a long way understanding, but it's something that they already know and it's already close to them. And that also, remember how we said, coming to your question yesterday, it's always easier to get a bit budget increase on an existing budget than an entire new budget. So it may actually help to say, okay, we do have these these safety assessments that we already do and that everyone agrees on needs to be done. And maybe we can extend a little bit of that budget and that knowledge and have safety people feed into security assessments. So that could actually be a worthwhile strategy. I'm not saying you should mingle or you should mesh up cybersecurity and safety assessment. I think that's the totally wrong way to approach things. But budget-wise, it can be a strategy to approach it.
Thank you, Sarah. I think this is an interesting tip as well for our audience if they need or require an additional budget. I think here as well, what is interesting when it comes to both of your feedbacks or answers is that very clearly there's a requirement to understand the business functionalities in general, but also a requirement to collaborative approach, right? Or you can't be in our siloed cybersecurity department trying to perform a risk scenario analysis. We need really to understand how it works and what are the priorities of the business or the organization in itself, even if it might be in many cases very different, especially knowing that we don't have that many resources in OT cybersecurity. So a lot of times we will have traditional IT security maybe that want to go into OT security, and therefore those are two very different businesses. Or organizations in general and priorities. But this leads me to another point, talking about assessments. We do understand that there is a lot of third parties in an OT environment, right? So we discussed the internal assessments. What about as well considering those third parties in such complex environment? How are we able to start or even achieve an accurate or reasonable result? Saltanat?
About third-party assessment, I think it comes down to the supply chain risk management. So if we speak about supply chain risk management, I know that CSA, CII supply chain program, they rolled out the questionnaire, how to assess the supplier. So they can use this questionnaire. But the second thing is right now the ISA secure, ISA 62443-1-4-1-2, there is a certification available. So you can look to the websites, and if it's a software, it should be certified by SDLC. If it's a PLC, it should be certified by embedded systems. If it's a system-wise, it should be certified by systems. And there is a levels 1, 2, 3. This you can do this way, but the other than questionnaire, I think Sarah can add it.
Well, I feel like a broken record at this point because somehow I have the feeling I've said that before in different panels, but that's okay because we're in a different context. For third-party assessments, I think it's similar like putting vendor requirements to security and forcing your vendors to employ security by design and things like that. It's the same thing again. If you do third-party assessments, I think one thing that's critical is for internal, like for external assessments, to be honest, once you put on the auditor role and say like, okay, I'm going to check your security, people are starting to hold back information and to be very, very defensive. So in my experience, what makes third-party assessments and also internal assessments actually better, also it's counterintuitive, is not making them too or creating an atmosphere that's more that of a partnership than of an actual assessment. Okay, I'm going to check what you're doing here and you have to pay for every mistake thing. So actually what works best, I think, and that's where I feel like a broken record because I know I've said that so many times during the last 2 days, but develop an approach that is more like a partnership. Try to collaborate, at least for your most important vendors, try to collaborate with them in understanding what your security should be like. And then do your assessments. Do assess what you have agreed on before. But that way you have a common goal and you're saying, okay, I'm externally assessing what we agreed on, but it's not like something they get by surprise. It's just a more fair approach. So it makes every assessment better. I think that also applies to OT pen tests. By the way, I'm a strong advocate for white box pen tests for OT. If you beforehand talked about what you actually want to assess and what you actually want to achieve by doing these assessments. And I think that also applies to third-party assessments, or in a way it maybe even applies or especially applies to third-party assessments.
Thank you, Sarah. Apparently research shows that if we repeat a fact 3 times, people remember it longer. So we hope that they will remember definitely collaboration.
Exactly
key,
that.
Right?
Yeah.
There's this aspect when it comes to assessment that from a practitioner point of view might be a challenge, right? Imagine the situation where we have the OT that is completely separate from the IT, and then we have a security person in charge that comes as a newly appointed person for cybersecurity, and then they start performing an assessment. So who is in charge of the mitigation afterwards? And who owns that? And how would that relationship work? Again, we are talking about an environment where there's not a very advanced maturity in OT security, and it's a new, I would say, initiative, starting from the IT, hiring someone from cybersecurity. And I'm saying IT specifically on purpose, because I have seen this in this part of the world. So, Sarah, would you like to start?
I think it's an excellent question, because if we have a tendency for people to drown into assessments and not have any time for mitigations, for actually applying mitigations, actually addressing the findings of assessments. So if you have a tight frequency of assessments, there's always a risk of people just doing assessment after assessment, and you just assess the same every time, because no one had time to actually implement the findings or actually improve something in between. So I don't have an easy answer to who is responsible for mitigations, but it definitely is important to ask the question before you do the assessment. Okay, first, what do you want to achieve with this assessment? And second, and who is going to work on the results? Because it doesn't help. Assessments are easy. You can hire an external consultancy, you can hire your vendor, you can hire Honeywell, you can hire whoever to do the assessment. But working with the results, you have to do yourself. And you should be very clear about who is going to do that, and if you do have the resources for that, and how much time you need for that before you do the next assessment, because doing an assessment before you address the last assessment is simply a waste of time.
Thank you. Saltanat?
Yeah, I think usually it comes down to the owners of the process. They are responsible for mitigation, but it depends again from side to side. In one side, for example, in refinery, the application security engineers, they were responsible. Their titles were application security for all the cybersecurity findings. And next side was field and instrumentation engineers, they were responsible. So again, it depends, but mostly it comes down to the owner of the process.
Thank you. I do believe that in realities as well, this collaborative approach, again, we're coming back to that, because if someone doesn't report to you and you ask them to do something, you must have another reason to make them do that, right? And collaboration, discussion, or support can help that. But we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I would like to have the time to take some, and some are very interesting. So let's start with this first one, which actually is all about how do we manage to get the support from the management when it comes to the OT security assessment.
Regulation.
How do we convince management to make the necessary investment for the OT security assessment?
If it's in Singapore, I think CSA, it usually comes down from the regulation.
It usually comes down?
From the regulation.
From the regulation. So regulation helps, definitely. But I would say, if we're talking about OT, we have as well other eventually non-CII industries that use as well operation technology, right? So in this case, if regulation doesn't apply, how are we able to build that a little bit and encourage the management to consider cybersecurity seriously? Sarah?
Well, again, there's no way hiding the fact that security costs money, and security assessment costs money as well. I found there are two strategies that could help convincing management. First of all, for risk assessments, and especially for semi-quantitative risk assessments, management knows risk. Management thinks in risk, and management can talk about risk because they usually do have some kind of risk assessment methodology already. So it definitely helps when you try to plug into what they're already doing, even if it means sacrificing a bit of your methodology because things look different. But in the end, it helps if they get results that they can actually work with. And second, I think, is a good argument to convince management to do the assessment is, first, if you do the assessment by an external party, we get an external neutral view on where we stand and where we are. And we get a way of prioritizing what we need to do. We don't need to do this entire huge list of things, but we get a way of prioritizing what we need to do. And we get it in a way that is understandable to you because we translate it to risk in the end. So that, of course, doesn't help the fact that it costs money. So if there's no money, there's no hope. But that at least makes sure, and then again, you need to make sure when you pick a methodology that the outcomes are in a way that your management can work with. The high-level ones, you don't want to give them the entire worksheets that we've seen in the presentation, obviously. Please don't. But the high-level risk, the high-level results should be in a format that management is used to. That makes it way easier to communicate and way easier to get management buy-in to actually do something like that.
Thank you.
It's a way of translating cybersecurity into their world.
Thank you, Sarah. I think there's one slide, especially that Saltanat you had, where we very clearly see a scenario where the two causes are one that is a traditional one, the second one is a cyber attack, but then the risk scenario is something that is traditionally understood in the business. And then you speak the same language, and that of course helps to understand that something harmful can happen with the cause being a cyber attack. And of course, management understands that probably better. Let's go to the next question, which I find also very interesting. So we still believe that some OT systems might be air-gapped. I'm saying that very, very cautiously. Is there good value of doing a penetration testing on those systems? And I do particularly like this, actually, question. Saltanat.
Already Magda mentioned there is not such a thing as an air gap anymore. So if you're using regular Windows stations, if you're using regular switch, yeah, you should do the penetration testing for insider threats. And again, insider threats, I've talked before, it can be malicious, it can be non-malicious, and you can do insider threats with privileged access, and we can do insider threats with non-privileged access pen testing.
Thank you, so Sarah?
I think I have a simple answer to that question, that is no. So that's maybe a personal opinion, but for OT systems, I think there are not that many cases where pen tests really add value. They do add value in two scenarios. First of all, you already know what's wrong, but you need to prove to management, and management only believes you once you've done a pen test. Then okay, do the pen test, you're already going to know the outcome. Second, you really believe you did all you can in order to secure your systems, and you don't want to know if you've forgotten something. So you went a long way in protecting your systems. You know that you've done everything that you know and you want to be doing, and now you want to know if someone else would find a way anyway. Because that's what a pen test is about. It's not testing a control or anything. It's like finding any kind of ways around your controls that you may not have thought about. If that's not your two scenarios, probably there are more important things to do in your OT systems right now than doing a pen test.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I would like to add on that. Coming from an IT perspective, I think the objective would be to understand, are we hackable, in between brackets, and how? Because if we consider that our environment is air-gapped, what about maintenance? I want to come back to that because I saw it and I find it interesting. Some of the vendors come with a USB key and plug it into an engineering station. This is as well a scenario that can be tested by a red teaming exercise. So maybe going a little bit further and trying to be innovative, understand what's our main objective and goal into performing this assessment. But this leads me to...
But maybe one point to that. There's maybe a difference between IT and OT, because in OT systems, in many cases, that questions, are we hackable and how, you really don't need a pen test for. Because once you're at the OT systems, I can give you the answer without a pen test, yes, you are. Because once you are in the network and once you have access to the systems, there's no access control, there's no authentication, of course you're hackable. You don't need any hacker to prove that to you for a lot of money. Put that money into assessments or anything, into risk assessments or into safety or into whatever, but it doesn't make any sense to put that into a pen test.
I really like that, Sarah, point. You're definitely hackable, and especially in OT environment. Saltanat, like it's a little bit debatable, the question, and as well provocative about penetration testing. And we just got through the idea of performing it. Would you like to add a little bit about it? Because I think you had a very clear methodology as well in one of your slides.
Yeah, OT pen test I put in a, you see, first comes risk assessment, then comes vulnerability assessment, then comes OT pen test. As Sarah mentioned, you really have all of your security controls in place, and you want to know, are you secure enough?
Thank you. We have now a very interesting question as well that is more practical. We have so many type of methodologies for risk assessments. So how are we able to choose one that is relevant for us? What should we follow? Any framework, standards? There's so many, and there's no standardization. Saltanat?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, yeah, as I said, you choose a methodology to the problems that you're trying to solve. So if you're in the beginning, you're trying to get the cybersecurity requirements, yes, you have to do risk assessment. Again, methodology, you have seen ISO 62443-3-2. It's good to follow. And in my opinion, ISO 27000 series doesn't apply to the OT. It's more applicable to the IT. So we don't have much methodologies in risk assessments. You just need to it's not the what methodologies to use if we think about risk assessment, it's how you're going to use it. Because I have seen ISO 62443 performed with 3 different subject matter experts and then 3 different outcomes.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to add to that?
I think that's another excellent question from the audience, actually. Because there are standards, but there are too many of them. And there are assessments, but there are too many of them. Before diving headfirst into any complicated, expensive assessment, I think it makes sense to ask yourself a couple of questions. So first, think about, it's the same for pen tests or for risk assessments or for vulnerabilities or for whatever. Why am I doing this? What do I want to achieve with this? And when you got that answer, you can look at the different methodologies and see if the outcomes actually help you achieve what you want. And the second one is looking at the income, at the inputs you need for the assessment, because that can be a quick way to sort some out as well. What does this assessment require as input? Do I have that? Does it apply to me? And can I, if I don't have it, can I produce it in a reasonable amount of time? Because if I can't, then probably the assessment is too complicated or too advanced, or at least not applicable to you.
Thank you, ladies. So this leads perfectly to the next question, which is actually, how often should we perform those assessments, especially in OT environment? And are there any specific, I would say, resources, strategies that we should consider in terms of manpower or budget? We talked a little bit about the budget, but I still would, and as well the manpower, would like to a little bit more understand your practical insights on the frequency of running assessments. Saltanat.
So in OT, for example, let's say you have mature environment. If you're going to have migration or changes, like you have this budget for the changes, put an assessment into this budget as well. This is the first thing that you wanted to do. And then next thing is try to, if you have budget, of course, try to automate the technical aspects of it, like the vulnerability assessment, your hardening assessment, it means security configuration assessment, file integrity monitoring. If you can, try to automate this. And then third, for annual risk assessment, it can be justified easily because every year, as far as I know, there is a risk register for all the company risks that needs to be updated. So according to that, you have to update the risks from cybersecurity perspective as well. For that, you can justify your assessment.
Sarah?
I think more important than talking about the frequency is talking about that each time you do an assessment, you actually build upon the one that you've done before. So you could say, okay, I evaluate the improvements that I've done before. It's important to incorporate assessments more than a certain frequency into your change management. So say, okay, once I change something, this is something that is subject to an assessment because I haven't assessed it before. Or also you could say, okay, I've got this year, I want to care about a certain area, for example. I want to care about how we do remote access. I want to care about planned XYZ or about the production of whatever. And then you focus the assessment on that one. So more important than really having a fixed frequency, and maybe you don't even have the time to address the findings in between assessments, as I pointed out earlier. Think about how you can build upon the assessments you've done earlier and incorporate them into regular procedures like change management. Do it one bit at a time instead of repeating overall huge assessments all the time.
Thank you, sir. I think we're reaching the end almost. There's so many other questions, but I would like to finish with the last question, which is basically related to how are we able to differentiate between, let's say, genuine system anomalies and perhaps threat actors' activities? And is this something that would help us with building a resilient organization? Saltanat.
This is product-related question, detection systems. So how you distinguish is the first, I would say, prerequisite is you have to know your environment very well, because I think we have discussed yesterday as well that the OT environment is very much deterministic. So you should know your environment very well, and you should have your network monitoring systems to know all the conversation, what's going on in your environment. This is more like either it's a false positive, yeah, or it's a truly threat actor. This way you can distinguish. If you don't know your environment, then it takes time, or you might find just how to say, suppressing your false positive, whereas it is the actual attack.
Sarah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think Satana did that right. You need a baseline. You need to know what's normal. And the only point I have to add is it may be worthwhile to ask your control system, because that has the sole purpose of monitoring your sensors and your actors, and maybe it knows something about what's normal. Some control systems actually have that functionality. Maybe you have records of sensor values from the past. So that's an easy way of, without buying an expensive security tool, that's a very easy way with the security tool you already have, your control system, to get an idea of normal values. Because that's the only way how you can tell apart normal and abnormal at that point.
Thank you very much, ladies. We are coming to the end of this panel. We have seen that risk assessment in OT environment is requiring a strategy that goes from traditional concept like having a visibility, but as well we address the fact that OT penetration testing and IT penetration testing are different. We might be using concepts like digital twins that are in an early stage of implementation, but it also comes down to a collaborative approach with our colleagues from the OT environment in order to make sure that actually we don't only assess, but we mitigate our findings. So I would like to extend my thanks to our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much, Saltanat. Thank you very much, Sarah, for your insights and sharing experiences. And thank you very much, our audience, for your questions. Very insightful and very helpful to get a better view of the priorities. And I hope you enjoyed this panel, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon ahead.